Hello everybody, my name is Dr. John Batten. I'm a Senior Fellow in Learning and Teaching and the Subject Group Lead for Sport and Exercise Sciences at the University of Winchester. And in this short research interview today, we're going to be talking to Dr. Janet Young, who's an Associate Professor in the First Year College at Victoria University in Melbourne. So thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us today, Janet.
Well, hello, John. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Very well. And so it's great to have you with us today, Janet, and we're going to be talking about a paper that we actually co-authored together, published in the Journal of Sport and Exercise Science, called "The Times Are They A-Changing? Evolving Attitudes in Australian Exercise Science Students' Attitudes Towards Sport Concussion." So I just wondered, Janet, if you could start by telling us a little bit about the rationale behind this work.
Okay. Well, whilst you mentioned, John, the paper's just been published, it actually had its beginnings about 5 or 6 years ago when we examined the attitudes of sports science students and their attitudes towards sports concussion. And following on from that, 5 years later, we were interested in whether those attitudes had changed. If so, in what direction they had changed. We thought with all the publicity that we've had in Australia about sports concussion that there might be a change, and the purpose of our study was to actually examine that. We didn't look into the reasons for the change. We were looking at the direction of the change and thought that the media would have a great interest in changing. There's been a great deal of interest in the media, and that might be perpetuating a change. So that was the rationale behind the study. And yes, we followed up with a similar group of sports science students, and they were across 2 universities. And 5 years later, we did examine the change in attitudes.
Yeah, perfect. I think in terms of there's been a lot of publicity around concussion over recent years, and it's great to try and think about how we might capture the impact of some of that publicity on the attitudes towards sports-related concussion.
Well, particularly, John, here in Australia, where we've had a number of young elite athletes retire early from sport because of concussions they've had. We've had a number of very high-profile former athletes speak up about the effects that they are suffering today as a result of concussion. So it's very, very topical at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's obviously a shame that we've had some people having to retire early as a result of concussion, and very similar situations in the UK as well, unfortunately. It's great that these people are obviously sharing their stories, speaking out and becoming advocates for hopefully for change. So in terms of trying to capture this change, in terms of the change in attitudes, what methods did you employ as part of this research project?
Okay. Well, similar to the first study that we did, we had an online questionnaire. We had 17 closed questions, and the participants were asked to indicate whether they agreed, and to the extent they agreed with 17 statements. So it was an online questionnaire, and we had similar questions so that we could provide a valid comparison to the study in 2015.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and then importantly, what did we find? What did the results show?
Well, the results were very encouraging. That the change of attitudes had taken place, and they had been positive changes, progressive changes towards attitudes such as whether they believed, for example, that it was safe to play after having been concussed, and there was general movement towards where you'd like it to be, that concussion was taken a lot more seriously, and that they were less risk averted, where they wouldn't necessarily continue to play if they had suffered concussion, So the attitudes had changed positively, and they had there was a scrutiny more of the media that, you know, they were not supporting the media profiling and suggesting this was a good thing to keep playing after being concussed. So the attitudes had changed positively. They were less risk aversion, where they would stop if they had been concussed. They wouldn't. They would complete. They indicated they would complete a full rehabilitation, and so generally we were surprisingly pleased with the results of the direction of the positive changes. But having said that, John, there was still about 25% of participants who indicated that despite the attitudes changing, they would still continue to play on, not to let teammates down. You know, they didn't take it, whilst the attitude had improved, it didn't mean their behaviour necessarily was going to change. And it was interesting with our cohort just recently, the last cohort in 2020, that I think it was about 47% of them had suffered concussion. And yet, having had that experience, 25% of them were still prepared to continue, you know, playing on. So attitudes had changed, not necessarily the related behaviours.
Yeah, some very interesting findings, Janet. And I mean, it's quite worrying that such a large proportion of the sample have received a concussion, but perhaps unsurprising, given what we now know about the prevalence of concussion across various sports. Positive, I guess, in that attitudes are shifting in the right direction. People becoming more aware of the risks, less likely to continue playing should they have a concussion, more likely to adhere to return to play protocols as well. But I think you're absolutely right in that there are still some worrying trends around translating these positive attitudes into behaviours, whereby people are still unfortunately continuing to play for reasons such as fear of not wanting to let teammates down, and so on. So still quite a bit of work to do in terms of those cultural implications to translate those positive attitudes into positive behaviours. Just in terms of kind of who should be interested in this work and perhaps even next steps, what are your thoughts in terms of how we might use these findings to support further change?
Well, I think at the very minimum here, Victoria University should be very interested in the results. The participants were sports science students from Victoria University. Many of the participants indicated they were playing sports and were playing sports for the university. So in terms of even policies that the university will implement, we feel the findings should be of interest. But look, it's much broader than that. That whilst we're trying to develop policies across sports, for national sporting organisations, for clubs, really any valid findings about people's attitudes, their behaviours, goes to inform that. And we had a cohort across a whole range of sports here. So I would think that in the policy development area of sports and clubs and sporting associations, this is some very valid findings that should be of interest in developing policies for the safety of all who participate, and saying that this is a concern. Attitudes are progressively changing. Behaviours are not necessarily changing, but nearly 50% of our cohort had suffered concussions. That's a concern, and there's that's real data. It's not anecdotal that there are participants out there. There are athletes, there are footballers who suffer concussion. We've got some valid data that supports this. So I would think our findings should be of interest across a whole range of levels of sporting organisations.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. To the implications for potentially Victoria University, that at local level, but like you say, more generally, that in terms of thinking about how we can translate these findings into action in terms of increasing more positive behaviours and seeing these policies put into practice as well. And as you mentioned earlier, I think in the interview as well, it'd be really great to do some further studies which tries to unpack kind of what is causing these shifts in attitude. So we mentioned the media, and we think the media is playing quite a big part in shifting these attitudes. But there may be some other factors as well, which again require some further unpacking. So hopefully something that we can pick up in future work.
Well, I think so. And whilst we didn't look at what drives the attitudes, certainly it would be of interest to look at the team environment, look at the impact or the influence of coaches, for example, teammates. So really to understand, whilst we have identified the change of attitudes, what are the triggers, what are the driving forces, and then how do we translate those changes into behavioural changes?
Yeah, I agree. Lots more work to be done, but some positive findings here nevertheless. Thank you very much for your time this morning, Janet. It's been fantastic to talk to you. I say this morning for me, this evening for you, I guess.
It is. It is.
But yeah, thank you very much for your time, and enjoy some time off this weekend.
Thank you, John. Yep, all the best to you too.
Thanks, Janet.